Okay, so if you remember last time we was looking at the period of the judges. Yeah, when you had the people, the Israelites living in the promised land, and they had the judges who were ruling over them. But it was a bad time. Yeah, people kept doing what was right in their own eyes. It was a very bad time. And what you saw during that time was, instead of them driving out the Canaanites, you saw the people becoming more and more like the Canaanites, and the people deteriorating, and they're not following after God. And there's a phrase that keeps coming up in the book of Judges which says, and there was no king in Israel in those days. And so you've got the idea of, there wasn't a king then and things were bad. Maybe they're going to get a king and things will be better. And so that brings us to what we're looking at now, which is the time of the kings. And more specifically, we're going to look at King David. So the Israelites, if you remember, were supposed to be a blessing to all the other nations. But in the times of the judges, we see they weren't like that. Instead, they start becoming like the other nations. And they don't have a king. And what happens is they ask for a king. They ask their final judge, who's called Samuel. They ask him for a king. And so what God does is God gives them a king. Now, unfortunately, the reason why they ask for a king is so that they can be like the other nations who've got kings. So they're not asking for a king so that they can be led properly to follow God, to follow Yahweh. Instead, they just want to be like the other nations. But God gives them a king anyway. He gives them a king, and he gives them King Saul. Now, in the language of those days, when God gives them the king, he's giving them his anointed one. You might have heard that phrase before, anointed one. Well, that is talking about God's king. And the Greek word for it is Christ, his Christ. And the Hebrew word for it is Messiah, his Messiah. So God gives the people his Messiah, or his Christ, or his anointed one. And the king is supposed to operate under God. He's an under king, if you like, because God, Yahweh, is the true king, and then the human king is a king underneath him who's supposed to operate under his authority. And so God chooses Saul to be the king for the people. They've asked for a king, and God gives them Saul. But Saul ends up being a king who disobeys God. And so what God does is God says, right, you're not going to be king anymore. Because the whole point of a king was not that he could do his own thing all the time, but that he would serve God. And because Saul is disobeying God, God says, you're not going to be the king of my people anymore. I'm going to choose another king. And he chooses a guy called David. And David becomes God's anointed one, God's Messiah, or God's Christ. And God makes a covenant with David. And this covenant is very important. And it's in 2 Samuel 7. It's on your handout.